June 1944. As Allied forces prepared for D-Day, the largest invasion in history, German intelligence was tracking a massive American army gathering in southeast England. The 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, commanded by General George Patton himself. Over 150,000 troops, hundreds of tanks, dozens of landing craft. Hitler was so convinced this army would invade at Calais that he kept his best divisions there, waiting, watching, ready to destroy the invasion force. There was just one problem. FUSAG didn't exist. The tanks were inflatable rubber. The landing craft were painted plywood. The radio traffic was fake. And the 150,000 soldiers, they were actually 1,100 artists, designers and sound engineers armed with the most unconventional weapons in military history, creativity and deception. This is the story of the Ghost Army, the classified unit that used art to win World War II. And their work was so secret that it remained classified for 50 years after the war ended. In early 1944, the US Army began recruiting soldiers with a very specific skill set, but they weren't looking for the best marksmen or the toughest fighters. They wanted artists, designers, sound technicians, advertising men, anyone who could create illusions. The recruitment was strange and secretive. Soldiers were pulled from art schools, advertising agencies and design studios. Many were told almost nothing about what they'd be doing, just that it was classified and unconventional. Among the recruits, Bill Blass, who would later become a famous fashion designer, Ellsworth Kelly, future renowned abstract painter, Art Kane, who'd become one of America's most celebrated photographers. These weren't typical soldiers, but the army had a very untypical job for them. They were formed into the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, officially a support unit. In reality, they were about to become the most elaborate deception operation in military history. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity. Make the Germans think American forces were somewhere they weren't. Draw enemy troops away from real invasion points. Create phantom armies that would tie up German divisions while the actual invasion happened elsewhere. But executing this concept would require more than just lying on the radio. It would require creating a complete sensory illusion, visual, auditory and electronic, convincing enough to fool German reconnaissance aircraft, radio intelligence, and even local civilians who might report to German agents. The Ghost Army was divided into 4 specialized units, each handling a different aspect of the deception. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers handled visual deception. Their job was to create fake equipment that looked real from the air and from a distance. And they did it with materials that seem absurd, inflatable rubber tanks that could be set up by 4 men in 15 minutes, dummy artillery pieces made from wood and canvas, fake airplanes constructed from lightweight frames covered in painted fabric. These weren't crude fakes. They were meticulously detailed. The artists painted shadows on the underside of inflatable tanks, so they'd look real from reconnaissance aircraft. They added fake track marks in the mud. They even positioned the dummies at slightly different angles, the way a real tank company would disperse to avoid artillery. The 3,100 to 30-second Signal Service Company Special handled sonic deception. They'd developed a library of recorded battlefield sounds. Tanks moving, troops assembling, equipment being loaded. These recordings were played through massive speakers mounted on half tracks. Speakers so powerful they could project sound 15 miles in the right conditions. Imagine being a German soldier in a quiet sector, and at 2 a.m. you start hearing the unmistakable sound of dozens of tanks assembling just beyond the tree line. You report it. Your commanders send reconnaissance, and by the time they arrive, the Ghost Army has already packed up and moved on. The signal company also handled radio deception. They would imitate the radio traffic patterns of real units, using the same call signs, the same communication procedures, creating the electronic signature of a full division, even though they were just a handful of radio operators. And finally, there was the special effects team. Soldiers who would play the role of the units they were impersonating. They'd wear the shoulder patches of different divisions. They'd go into local towns, deliberately let slip information about their unit. They'd be loud in bars, talking about upcoming operations, all carefully scripted to feed false information to German intelligence. The training was intense. These artists had to learn military doctrine well enough to fake it convincingly. Radio operators had to master the communication styles of the units they'd imitate. The entire deception had to be so detailed that even if the Germans suspected something, they couldn't be sure it was fake. By spring 1944, the Ghost Army was ready for their first major operation, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The success of D-Day depended on surprise. The Allies had chosen Normandy as the invasion point, but they needed Hitler to believe the invasion would come at Calais, the shortest distance across the English Channel. If German forces concentrated at Normandy, the invasion could fail catastrophically. Enter Operation Fortitude, the massive deception plan that the Ghost Army would help execute. While the real invasion force assembled in southwest England, the Ghost Army would create a phantom army in southeast England, directly across from Calais. They called it the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG. And on paper, it was terrifying: 12 divisions, over 150,000 troops, commanded by General George Patton, who the Germans considered the Allies' most dangerous general. In reality, it was inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and incredible artistry. The Ghost Army set up camp in Kent and Sussex, the counties closest to Calais. They inflated hundreds of rubber tanks and positioned them in fields where German reconnaissance aircraft would photograph them. They parked dummy landing craft in harbours and estuaries. They set up fake supply depots filled with empty crates arranged to look like ammunition and fuel storage. The visual deception alone was impressive, but it was the details that sold the illusion. The artists didn't just inflate the tanks, they created an entire fake base infrastructure. Laundry lines with uniforms hanging to dry, tyre tracks leading to and from the dummy vehicles, even fake secret documents that were strategically left where German spies might find them. The radio operators transmitted thousands of fake messages, mimicking the communication patterns of a real army group preparing for invasion. They coordinated their fake radio traffic with actual troop movements elsewhere, creating a consistent electronic signature that German signals intelligence would intercept and analyze. Meanwhile, the special effects team played their part perfectly. Soldiers wearing fusag patches would go into local pubs and talk, carefully as if trying not to be overheard, about the upcoming invasion at Calais. They'd complain about the weather, worry about the crossing, mention specific details about their fictional units. British intelligence even sent double agents to feed the Germans secret information, confirming that Patton was commanding a massive force preparing to invade at Calais. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. And it worked. Brilliantly. German reconnaissance photos showed the tanks. German radio intelligence tracked the communications. German spies reported the troop presence. Hitler's intelligence staff analysed it all and concluded the main invasion would come at Calais. Normandy might be a diversion, but the real threat was Patton's army in southeast England. When D-Day came on June 6, 1944, German forces were spread thin at Normandy. Hitler kept entire Panzer divisions at Calais, waiting for Patton's phantom army. For weeks after the Normandy landings, the Germans still believed the real invasion was coming at Calais. The Ghost Army had pulled off one of the greatest deceptions in military history, but their work was just beginning. After D-Day, the Ghost Army deployed to France and began a series of tactical deceptions across the European theatre. They would conduct over 20 major operations between June 1944 and the end of the war, each designed to fool the Germans about Allied strength and intentions. Their typical operation went like this. A real Allied division would quietly pull out of a sector. The Ghost Army would move in and impersonate them. They'd inflate the rubber tanks, set up the dummy artillery, play the sound effects, broadcast fake radio traffic, all to convince the Germans that the sector was still heavily defended. Meanwhile, the real division would redeploy to another area for an actual attack. By the time the Germans realized they'd been fooled, the battle would already be won elsewhere. One of their most important operations came during the Rhine River crossing in March 1945. The real assault was planned for one location, but the Ghost Army set up a massive fake build-up 10 miles away. They inflated tanks, played recordings of bridge-building operations, created fake smoke screens to suggest crossing preparations. German artillery bombarded the fake positions for hours, wasting ammunition on rubber and wood. Meanwhile, the real crossing happened with minimal resistance, but the work was far more dangerous than it sounds. The Ghost Army operated close to the front lines, sometimes within German artillery range. When you're setting up inflatable tanks in a field, you're completely exposed. If German reconnaissance spotted you close enough to see the deception, you could be killed before you escaped. Several Ghost Army soldiers were killed or wounded during operations. Artillery strikes hit their positions. One unit was nearly overrun when a German patrol stumbled onto their fake encampment. They had to quickly collapse the inflatables and retreat, barely escaping. There was also the constant psychological pressure. These men weren't trained infantry. They were artists pretending to be soldiers, operating in combat zones with minimal weapons or protection. Their success depended entirely on the Germans falling for the illusion. If the deception failed and the Germans realized they were facing a fake unit instead of a real division, the consequences could be catastrophic. And they could never tell anyone what they were really doing. Not other soldiers, not civilians, not even their families back home. As far as everyone else knew, they were just a headquarters support unit, nothing special, nothing classified. One soldier described it perfectly. We were running a travelling roadshow, except our audience was trying to kill us. The operations varied wildly in scale and complexity. Sometimes it was a simple overnight setup. Inflate a few tanks, play some sounds, then disappear before dawn. Other times, it was elaborate multi-day deceptions involving hundreds of dummies, complex radio nets, and coordinated special effects. Operation Viersen in March 1945 was their largest and most complex deception. They simulated 2 entire divisions, about 30,000 troops, to cover the real units repositioning for the final push into Germany. The deception involved over 600 inflatable vehicles, constant radio traffic, and sound effects, played for 72 hours straight. German intelligence bought it completely. They reported 2 American divisions in defensive positions, never realizing those divisions were actually 60 miles away preparing for the offensive. As the war progressed and the Ghost Army's techniques were refined, they became incredibly efficient. They could set up a fake battalion in under 2 hours, a fake division in under 12, and they could pack up and disappear even faster if enemy action required it. But efficiency came with risk. The faster they worked, the more corners they had to cut, and cutting corners in a deception operation could mean the difference between fooling the enemy and getting killed. The psychological toll on the Ghost Army was unique among military units. These men lived a strange double life, artists pretending to be combat soldiers, creating elaborate lies while surrounded by the very real horrors of war. They saw actual combat. They witnessed the aftermath of battles. They passed through liberated concentration camps. They dealt with all the trauma that came with being in a war zone, but they couldn't process it the way other soldiers did, because they couldn't talk about what they were actually doing. Imagine watching friends in real combat units die while you're inflating rubber tanks. Imagine the survivor's guilt of being in a relatively safer role while pretending to be in a dangerous one. Imagine never being able to explain to anyone why your contribution mattered. Some Ghost Army veterans struggled with this for decades. They'd fought in World War II, but when they came home and people asked what they did, they couldn't say. The operation was classified, so they'd mumble something about headquarters support and change the subject. Their families sometimes thought they hadn't really served in combat, that they'd had easy, safe jobs while other men fought and died. The veterans couldn't correct this misconception without violating their security clearance. One veteran described attending a reunion of the division they'd impersonated during a critical operation. The real soldiers talked about the battle, the casualties they'd taken. The Ghost Army veteran knew he'd helped make that victory possible by drawing German forces away from that sector, but he couldn't say anything. He just sat quietly and listened. There were also failures. Not every deception worked. Sometimes German reconnaissance saw through the illusion. Sometimes local civilians reported that the equipment was fake. Sometimes the wind would catch an inflatable tank wrong and flip it over, revealing the deception. When a deception failed, the consequences could be severe. If the Germans realized they were facing a fake unit, they might attack aggressively, and the Ghost Army had minimal defensive capability. Or they might realize the deception meant a real attack was coming elsewhere and redeploy accordingly, negating the entire operation. The unit lost men. Not many compared to infantry divisions, but every loss hurt deeply. These were artists, not soldiers trained for combat. When an artillery shell hit their position or a German patrol ambushed them, they died trying to create art, not fighting conventionally. When the war ended in May 1945, the Ghost Army was quietly disbanded. The soldiers were sworn to secrecy and sent home. Their records were classified. Their operations were buried in military archives marked top secret. And for the next 50 years, almost no one knew they existed. The veterans went back to civilian life. Many returned to their art careers. Bill Blass became a fashion icon. Ellsworth Kelly became one of America's most important abstract painters. Art Kane photographed some of the most famous album covers and magazine spreads in American history. But they couldn't talk about the Ghost Army. The classification remained in effect through the Cold War. The Pentagon's reasoning was that the techniques might be used again, so they needed to stay secret. Think about that. These men had helped win World War II using one of the most creative military operations in history. But they couldn't tell their wives, their children, their friends. For decades, their most significant accomplishment had to remain hidden. Some veterans kept personal mementos, sketches they'd made, photographs they'd taken, but they kept them private, locked away. The official history of World War II barely mentioned them, if at all. It wasn't until 1996, more than 50 years after the war ended, that the Ghost Army operations were finally declassified. Veterans, many now in their 70s and 80s, could finally tell their stories, and the stories were incredible. Historians realized that operations they'd studied for decades had actually been influenced by this secret unit. Battles that seemed inexplicable. Why did the Germans defend empty sectors? Why did they waste artillery on certain positions? Suddenly made sense. The declassification led to documentaries, books, and museum exhibitions. The Ghost Army finally got recognition for their contribution to winning the war. Congress even awarded them the Congressional Gold Medal in 2024, nearly 80 years after their service. But by then, most of the veterans were gone. They'd lived most of their lives unable to share this remarkable story. Some died, never getting to talk about it publicly. The Ghost Army's techniques seem almost quaint now, in an age of satellite surveillance and electronic warfare. You couldn't fool modern reconnaissance with an inflatable tank, but in 1944, with the technology available at the time, it was cutting-edge military innovation. What made it work wasn't just the technology, it was the artistry. The Ghost Army succeeded because they understood something fundamental about deception. It's not about creating a perfect copy. It's about creating something convincing enough that the enemy sees what they expect to see. German intelligence expected to see Allied divisions preparing for attacks. So when they saw tanks and heard radio traffic and received spy reports, they believed it. The Ghost Army gave them a story that made sense, and the Germans believed that story because it fit their assumptions. This principle, using an enemy's expectations against them, is still relevant in modern warfare. Military deception hasn't disappeared, it's just evolved. The techniques are different, but the psychology is the same. The Ghost Army also proved something important about warfare. Creativity can be as powerful as firepower. These 1,100 artists and designers arguably saved thousands of lives by drawing German forces away from real battles. They won engagements without firing a shot. Modern militaries still study Ghost Army operations, not to copy their specific techniques, but to understand their approach to deception. How do you identify enemy assumptions? How do you create a convincing false narrative? How do you coordinate multiple deception elements into a coherent illusion? Some of the Ghost Army's artwork survived. Sketches and paintings they made during the war, both of their fake operations and the real war around them, are now in museums and private collections. There's something poignant about seeing a detailed sketch of an inflatable tank next to a painting of actual combat destruction. These artists experienced the war from a unique perspective. They created fake wars while surrounded by the real one. Their art reflects that duality, the absurdity and creativity of their deceptions alongside the genuine horror of what they witnessed. The Ghost Army's greatest triumph was also their greatest burden. They were so good at being invisible that even history almost forgot them. For 50 years, one of World War II's most innovative military operations remained classified. The men who executed it couldn't share their story. Military historians writing about D-Day and the European campaign didn't know the full truth about why certain German decisions seemed strategically incomprehensible. The real story was hiding in plain sight, buried in classified archives, known only to the veterans who'd been sworn to secrecy. When the truth finally emerged in 1996, it changed our understanding of the war. Battles that seemed like straightforward victories turned out to have been enabled by elaborate deceptions. The success of major operations depended on rubber tanks and sound effects as much as real firepower. The Ghost Army proved that in warfare, perception can be more powerful than reality. A fake army that the enemy believes in can be more effective than a real army that goes unnoticed. 1,200 artists with inflatable tanks tied up German divisions that could have changed the outcome of critical battles. Next time you hear about D-Day, remember, while thousands of soldiers were landing on beaches under fire, 1,000 artists were in England, making sure Hitler's best troops were waiting at the wrong beach, watching for an invasion that would never come. The Ghost Army won battles without fighting them. They saved lives without firing shots. They changed history with art. And for 50 years, almost no one knew they existed. That might be the most successful deception of all. The Ghost Army is just one of dozens of classified World War II operations that shaped the war in ways we're still discovering. If you want more untold stories from the war, the secrets, the deceptions, and the hidden truths, subscribe to Forgotten Front. Next video, the Night Witches, the all-female Soviet bomber squadron that terrified the German army so badly that shooting down just one earned an automatic medal. What other secret World War II operations should I cover? Drop your suggestions in the comments.